And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first episode of 2017 of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks, and I'm coming to you from an undisclosed location in Wicker Park of Chicago, Illinois, on Saturday, March 4th, 2017. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the recap of the 2016-17 MLB offseason, highlighting some of the major moves that were made around the big leagues. We're going to discuss the state of the White Sox, my favorite team, of course, as they have decided to take a new direction with the franchise and begin a long rebuilding process. We will discuss what it'll take for the defending world champion Chicago Cubs. It sounds very strange saying that, but it happened. We'll go ahead and discuss what they need to do to defy history once again this year, at least recent history, in order to repeat as champions. And we'll also discuss what I've been doing during the offseason to prepare myself for the upcoming season and my mindset as a diehard baseball fan. And also we'll discuss the induction of the 2017 Baseball Hall of Fame class, which features three prominent superstars from the 90s, as well as a major front office executive from the 90s, and the most recent commissioner, Rob Manfred's predecessor, going into the Hall of Fame as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our discussion of the offseason. So around the big leagues this offseason, the free agency class wasn't as strong as it has been in recent years, but there was plenty of movement, plenty of big names moving from team to team via trade and free agency. One move that I think that I'm actually going to not start with the move that people think I would start talking about. I'm actually going to start with discussing the defending champs, the Cubs, and them losing their starting center fielder, their leadoff man, the guy who really, I thought, started the engine for their offense in the playoffs and the World Series, and that's Dexter Fowler. I thought that Fowler had an excellent season last year and was really an integral part of the Cubs' last 2 years. Really raised his game to a new level. Seemed to tap into that potential that the Rockies and Astros previously thought he had. Obviously, the Cubs coaching staff, Joe Madden and his staff, did an excellent job with restructuring how Fowler played defense in center field by having him play deeper because he didn't do well in going back on balls. So they had him play deeper so he could come in on balls, and that suddenly, transformed him from being an average defensive center fielder to certainly an above average defensive center fielder, if not an excellent one. And then, of course, what he always had was the ability to get on base and make contact. And it seemed like he took that to a new level in 2016 when the Cubs won the World Series. Very high on base percentage. I believe he hit around 280, 290. High teens with the home runs. Like I said, it seemed like he was in the middle of everything big that happened for the Cubs offensively in October and early November. In particular, as all my friends who are Cubs fans will definitely remember, as one of those indelible moments of being a baseball fan for the rest of their lives. Fowler led off Game 7 of the World Series by hitting a home run to dead center field off of Indians ace Corey Kluber. And that basically got the party started for the Cubs offense in that game. So he was just a really clutch player all the way around, an excellent defensive player, solid offensive guy. So you knew he was going to get a big deal. And the Cubs, they really like Albert Almora, who's their young center fielder now. And they felt that they could replace at least some of the production from the left side by signing actually a former Cardinal, John Jay. So this year will be somewhat of a transition year, I think, in center field for the Cubs as Almora gets acclimated to playing essentially every day. But what ended up happening with Fowler is that he went to the rival St. Louis Cardinals. He signed a big deal there to go to St. Louis. They've been having issues for years finding more offense, especially at the top of the order outside of Matt Carpenter. So they needed to get a bat that was going to be consistent. they needed a center fielder that could play some good defense, and now they have that with Fowler at the top of the order. He's going to provide certainly an extra offensive punch for him. I think the Fowler to St. Louis story is interesting for a number of reasons, not just because you have essentially an elite player at this point. He's becoming one of the elite center fielders in the game, even on the other side of 30. You have a guy leaving the world champions to go to their arch rivals, very similar to Johnny Damon leaving the Red Sox for the Yankees in the mid-2000s. That's a story in itself, but it's nothing completely unusual. The one thing I thought that was interesting about Fowler going to St. Louis is obviously there is kind of a dynamic with Cardinal fans. I have to say this because this is the age that we live in, the racial climate, the political climate, whatever you'd like to describe it as, but there have been some interesting articles written on this about Dexter Fowler discussing his political views in terms of our president and some of the things that he's done since he's been in office, and he's been active in social media discussing these issues. And it's interesting because Cardinal fans, they're known as hashtag the best fans in baseball, and that's obviously when you hear people put the hashtag in front of it, it's obviously kind of a sarcastic phrase that they're using because in this situation, as Fowler, an African American player and one of the prominent African American players in the big leagues, speaks out politically, and he's not wearing a Cubs uniform anymore. Now he's wearing a Cardinal uniform. The mentality of the Cardinal fan from social, political standpoint is vastly different than a Cub fan. That's when you have these Cardinal fans, they get on social media and say some of the negative things that they've been saying about Fowler, and some of it's racial, some of it's just, shut up, you're a ball player, just go out and play. This isn't the Cardinal way. I think that it's definitely going to provide an interesting dynamic. The city of St. Louis, as great as their fans have been in terms of their passion and knowledge for the game, there is a vibe about whether or not as a free agent, as a black or Latino player, whether or not you can seriously consider going to St. Louis because of the kind of the racial, social dynamic in that city with that fan base. So I think that Fowler is kind of breaking down a barrier in a way. The Cardinals haven't been too successful in signing free agency players who are men of color in recent years. I don't think that's a coincidence. And it'll be very interesting. I'll be very interested to see what happens if Fowler continues to speak out in social media, or even better, I shouldn't say even better, but even more interesting, if he were to start the season slow, like a lot of free agents do when they come to new cities. So I just think it's an interesting dynamic. It's going to really put Cardinal fans to the test to see if they can actually act like grown-ups and really be the best fans in baseball, or if that's all just a phony cliche like a lot of Cubs fans would tell you. So I think that's a very interesting move in the offseason, but obviously the move that garnered the most attention this offseason involved my favorite team, the Chicago White Sox, and their trading of Chris Sale during the winter meetings in December. By moving Sale, that obviously signals the beginning of a rebuild. General manager Rick Hahn has been very forthcoming about that. During the offseason, he's been very transparent in saying, hey, we're going to be moving forward with this rebuild, so we're going to start by dealing our ace, the best player that we've had in our franchise since Frank Thomas. We're going to go ahead and deal him off to the Boston Red Sox. And in return, the White Sox got arguably the best prospect in baseball in second baseman Yohan Moncada. They also picked up one of the top right-handed prospects in baseball, right-handed pitcher Michael Kopech. They've also picked up two other minor leaguers who have a high ceiling. I know that Victor Diaz, the power arm right-handed reliever he's already, I believe, 22 years old, but and he's been kind of in the lower levels of the minor league system with the Red Sox, but he projects to be a bullpen arm within the next 2 years, I'd say. So that was considered by many of the scouting and minor league and prospect experts to be another excellent pickup. And then a guy who intrigues me is Luis Alexander Basabe. He's a center fielder with a lot of tools, some speed, good defense, gets on base. They say if he can hit at the higher levels of the minor leagues, he does stand a chance to be a starting center fielder someday. So the White Sox potentially in this deal, in trading their ace, may have picked up a guy who could eventually be an all-star second baseman in Moncada, potentially an all-star starting pitcher in Kopech, a guy who throws triple digits right now. And as an expert and pitching coach Don Cooper have said, needs to work on his command. But, I mean, when you're 21, you're throwing 100, that's pretty good. And then, you pick up a quality relief arm in Diaz, and then potentially at least a fourth outfielder, if not a starting center fielder in Basabe. The White Sox, they made out really well in this deal. But that's funny because it was probably their second best deal of the offseason in terms of return value in a trade. I would say the number one was a couple days later when they traded their right fielder, Adam Eaton, to the Washington Nationals, and they picked up three prominent pitching prospects. Obviously, starting with the former I believe he was at the time the number 3 prospect according to Major League Baseball, according to MLB.com, starting pitcher Lucas Giolito, who had already pitched in the major leagues with the Nationals last year, and he's widely considered one of the best pitching prospects in the game as well. And then they picked up Reynaldo Lopez, another guy who pitched in the big leagues last year, who's considered one of the top right-handed starting pitching prospects in the game. They got him as well. And then a guy who intrigues me is a kid that the Nats drafted in the first round last year, Dane Dunning, another starting pitcher. Probably doesn't quite have the ceiling that Lopez and Giolito and Kopech do, but he's still considered a maybe on the Spencer Adams level of pitching prospects for the White Sox. For those of you who don't know who Spencer Adams is, he's a Double-A pitcher for the White Sox who was drafted out of high school in the state of Florida in 2013, I believe, and he's steadily progressed up the system. He's considered to be like a back-end starter, but quite probably on that level. I mean, the White Sox in the two trades that they made probably filled out like 3/5 of their pitching staff for the future if everything goes well. So it's an excellent position to be in. And then, of course, Carson Fulmer still here. And at the big league level, you still have Carlos Rodon. And you still have Jose Quintana, technically. He's still on the big league roster. He's still with the team. He made the All-Star team last year. But he has the opportunity to get traded, which will bring me to my next point in the next segment, what the White Sox are going to do next. And also I'd like to discuss what the Cubs are going to be doing here, as they've made, as we talked earlier about how they let Dexter Fowler go to free agency and he signed with the Cardinals, but they replaced him with at least part of his production with John Jay, and what they're planning on doing in order to repeat here in 2017. So that'll conclude the first segment of this year's first episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. When we come back, we're going to talk about the rest of the big leagues and what happened in the offseason, as well as what the Cubs are planning on doing to try to defend their world championship as we head into the 2017 MLB season. We will be right back. And welcome back to the premiere episode of the 2017 MLB season for the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. And in the first segment, we talked about some of the offseason moves that have been made so far, but we really only highlighted the Cubs and the White Sox. I wanted to get a little bit more in depth first with what the White Sox are planning on doing this 2017 season as they begin their rebuild, and then we'll go into the Cubs a little bit more in depth, and then we will talk about the rest of the big leagues as to what they've done so far in the offseason, as spring training has already begun here in the first week of March. So where we left off, we were kind of talking about what the White Sox, their current state right now is they've already traded all-star caliber outfielder Adam Eaton to the Nationals and Cy Young caliber pitcher Chris Sale to the Boston Red Sox, and they got 7 prospects in return. So now, just to kind of state where they are, excuse me, technically they still have Jose Quintana, their number 2 starter last year, who will be the ace of the staff this year going into opening day. He's still on the roster. It appears to be somewhat of a tentative situation because the White Sox were, all reports were indicating that they were very active in trying to move him and in the offseason, and they were looking at a number of teams. Some of the teams of note that were highlighted to be going after him because they felt like they were in a position to contend in 2017, and they had the prospects to pull off the move. The Pittsburgh Pirates, the Houston Astros, and the New York Yankees, and to a certain extent the Atlanta Braves and the Los Angeles Dodgers were all looking at Quintana. The White Sox, in return, I believe, were most likely asking for a major outfield prospect, maybe another infield prospect of some sort, and probably 2 more pitchers, I'd imagine. And those all 3 to 4 of those teams, they do fit the bill, especially the Yankees, Pirates, and Astros. They all had those types of players. So, it was an interesting offseason from that regard, but none of these teams were willing to make those trades happen because you're starting to see a trend around the big leagues where teams do not want to move. They don't want to part ways with their top prospects because they believe these guys are really going to produce. And I think that all kind of started with the first when the Astros started having success early in 2015, and then once the Cubs got really hot after the All-Star break in 15, and then ended up getting that wild card, and then of course last year winning the World Series, people kind of looked at the Cubs and said, well, they drafted and they built all these guys. They were able to build their minor league system up and really develop all their young guys. They didn't make too many trades. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer when it comes to the Cubs in particular because the reality is they are a major market team, much more so than the Sox, even though they play in the same city. They have the lion's share of the fan base here, meaning that they're going to have the lion's share of the revenue, coming into their organization, and therefore they can expand their payroll a bit. I'm not saying that the White Sox aren't capable of doing it. I think they certainly are, and there will be pressure on them as they get closer to the time period where they want to compete, maybe in 2019 or so. There's going to be pressure on them to spend money then. But the Cubs last year, going into 16, were on the doorstep of competing for a world title. So they took the opportunity and they went out and spent big in free agency. They went out and got Jason Hayward, John Lackey, Ben Zobrist, and then the year before that they went out and signed John Lester to big money. So, it's not entirely true that the Cubs built their team from scratch from the minor leagues. Obviously, Chris Bryant and Kyle Schwarber and Javier Baez are all Cubs minor league products, but they supplemented those minor league guys with free agency and trades. Trading for Aroldis Chapman in the offseason. Or I shouldn't say in the offseason, right before the deadline, they traded for Chapman. So, that was another move that they made in the process of building a world championship ball club. So now, when you look at the Cubs, speaking of them, they're coming off of the historic World Series run. first world title in 108 years. So obviously the biggest sports story in the world in 2016 for sure. Nothing bigger than that. So now they're coming into 2017 with a good chunk of their core coming back. Their popular clubhouse guy and backup catcher who came through in the clutch a number of times in the World Series, especially in Game 7 with a home run of his own, David Ross. He has retired, and I believe he's going into I think he's partially working for the Cubs, and he's going to do some TV stuff. I'm not really sure what his plans are now that he's in retirement, but at the age of 38, being a catcher, it's pretty tough to hang on. But he had an excellent career, and he ended up with 2 World Series rings. So, but that's a guy that they're going to have to replace. I know that Contreras is going to end up being their starting catcher, Wilson Contreras. And then I believe Miguel Montero is coming back for them, but David Ross certainly played a key part in their championship run. So that's one guy they have lost. They also lost Dexter Fowler, as we mentioned in the previous segment. They replaced his left-handed hitting production with John Jay. And then from the right side, their prospect who played quite a bit in the playoffs last year, Albert Almora, he will share time in center field with Jay. It'll also be interesting to see how Kyle Schwarber mixes in with this team this year. He was out for most of the year last year with the knee injury after colliding with Fowler in center the first week of the season. So he will, he DH'd in the World Series. They cleared him to hit, but they didn't clear him to play the field. So from what I understand, he's taken some reps behind the plate as a catcher thus far in spring training. He's also going to play some outfield. Obviously he's there for his bat. Nobody's going to get him confused with the Gold Glove player defensively. But I know that Madden's talked about leading him off, which I think is an excellent idea because he gets on base as much as anybody. So I think that would be a really good move if the Cubs did that. But the only issue is his defense and where they're going to play him. They do have miles and miles of depth, both in the outfield and, catcher. I mean, obviously, I know Madden likes to carry 3 catchers, so they could have him as like the third catcher and not use whoever their backup will be to Contreras as much. So that'll be an interesting piece. And I stand corrected about Montero. Montero had he made a statement about not getting enough playing time after the World Series ended. So I'm assuming when a guy talks about not getting enough time, enough at bats, that's like a telltale sign that guy's going to be out. So I'm going to operate under the assumption that Miguel Montero is not with the Cubs anymore. So I apologize, folks, for not fact-checking that, but I'll go ahead and make that assumption right now. So with Contreras and Schwarber in the fold behind the plate and whomever else they're going to bring in, they're going to have similar depth to what they had last year. I think a major question about the Cubs going into this 2017 season is whether or not a pitching staff with 3 of their main starters on the wrong side of 30 in a third year of a potential postseason run are going to be able to hold up and throw that many innings. I don't have any questions about John Lester and John Lackey because those guys have pitched in the postseason so much in their careers and they've been so successful that I don't think that they would. I mean, and for Lackey, this is his second postseason run with the Cubs, so he doesn't have maybe quite as much mileage as Lester would. But I guess the one guy that two guys that I'm going to be curious to see what happens with them this year on the mound, as far as the pitching staff is concerned, are Jake Arrieta and Kyle Hendricks. Mainly because Arrieta's going into his free agency year. He's going to want big money. His agent is Scott Boras. He's 31. I think he'll be 32 during the season this year. So he's got he's got an interesting story behind him heading into what should be basically the only opportunity for him to make major money as a big leaguer. When you hit free agency this late, when you're this much of a late bloomer, you only get one chance at it. So, especially for a pitcher, when you hit 31, 32 as a pitcher, people start doubting you, fair or unfair. So, I think that'll be an interesting situation for Arrieta and his agent to approach come the 2017-18 offseason. So if he has a great year again this year, I think he'll still get a pretty good contract. If not, we'll see. But I don't think that Theo Epstein and Jed Hoyer are going to give in to Scott Boras' demands. I think they're a little smarter than that, and they're a little bit more mentally tough than that to give in to the demands. Maybe a small market team looking to make a splash might be, more of a candidate to sign Arrieta if he has another All-Star season. But I think it'll be interesting. This could be Arrieta's last year, even if he has a really good year. I think he'll still have a pretty good year, probably make the All-Star team if he stays healthy. And then he will probably leave for more money because the Cubs, and rightfully so, probably won't be willing to give that much money to a 32-year-old pitcher. Hendricks is an interesting guy because he's more of a, I'm not going to call him a junk baller because that phrase isn't really used anymore, but he's not exactly a power pitcher. He's more of a cerebral Greg Maddux type. So, coming into this season, we'll see if really what he's made of. I think he had an awesome year last year, but it'll be interesting to see how the league adjusts to him here as he tries to, replicate what he did last year on the mound. And then finally, the last piece I wanted to talk about with the Cubs is their bullpen. They traded their young outfielder Jorge Soler to the Kansas City Royals for Wade Davis. Davis was injured most of the season last year, but obviously in 15 when they won the World Series, he was the closer for them, and he was one of the best in the game, in 15. And in 14, when Greg Holland was the closer, he was one of the best setup men in the game. So Davis is coming off an injury, but he was obviously still really effective when he was healthy. I think the main question will, of course, be his health. But assuming he's healthy, he should be at least an adequate replacement for Aroldis Chapman, because Chapman, he had his points where he struggled for the Cubs, especially in the postseason. In particular, you think of Game 4 against the Giants, or I believe that was Game 3 when Connor Gillespie hit that triple off him. And then, of course, Game 7 of the World Series, they kind of extended him and asked him to throw probably a few more pitches than he was capable of, and it ended up hurting them a bit. So, it didn't hurt him too bad, obviously, because they ended up winning it. But I don't think that losing Chapman to the Yankees is that big of a loss. And I do think that Davis will be able to be a good enough pickup for the Cubs as they head into this repeat year. So when it comes to the repeat and making predictions, you guys will have to tune into my podcast at the end of the month when I actually make my regular season predictions for the 2017 season. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and close this segment out on what the Cubs have done in the offseason, and I will move into what happened around the rest of the big leagues in the 2016-17 offseason, and we will also discuss the Hall of Fame voting for the 2017 Cooperstown class that's going in. We'll talk about the inductees that got in the Hall this year, and what changed and what didn't change in terms of steroid users and the Hall of Fame. So we'll be right back with another segment of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. And folks, welcome back to the 2017 premiere episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. And before we jump into the rest of the big league offseason, I'd like to pull a Tony Reale here from ESPN's Around the Horn and pardon the interruption, and do another correction. And this is in regards to Miguel Montero again. Yes, he is still with the Cubs. I guess him and Joe Madden and Theo Epstein, they reconciled over dinner the other week, and now everything's peachy again. So Montero's back. He's in the fold, and I'm assuming he'll be Wilson Contreras' backup catcher as we head into 2017 with, as I mentioned before, Kyle Schwarber sharing time behind the plate as they try to get him more at-bats heading into the 17 season. So, Cubs fans, I apologize for that. I did in fact check that, but yeah, Montero, the guy who hit the big grand slam, Game 1 of the NLCS against the Dodgers, he is back in a Cubs uniform. So let's move around the big leagues. Let's fly around here and talk about some of the moves that were made in the offseason. First stop, I'd like to kind of go alphabetically here, at least to start off. Probably won't stay in that order, but let's start off with the Atlanta Braves. I thought that they're in an interesting situation as they leave Turner Field after only playing there for like 20 years to move out to their new ballpark in the suburbs in Atlanta. They're trying to at least build to be a contending club in the National League East here in the next couple years as they open up that stadium this year. And with the opening of the new ballpark, they have a very interesting pitching staff going out and getting R.A. Dickey, Jaime Garcia, I believe, and, of course, the 40-something big sexy Bartolo Colon. That's something else. Colon, he's still pitching. He's a favorite of around the big leagues. I don't know. If you watch the game, you can't help but love Bartolo Colon and what he does out there. So he, much to the chagrin of his Mets teammates, in particular Noah Syndergaard, he left Queens, he left the Mets, and he's now pitching in Atlanta for the Braves. So they've made some interesting moves this offseason. They were rumored heavily in the Chris Sale trade talks, but they didn't have the position player prospects to pull the trigger on that deal. The Braves do have a lot of pitching prospects in their system right now, but they're going to need to figure out a way to acquire more hitting prospects besides Ender Enciarte in center and, of course, Dansby Swanson at shortstop. They're going to need some more pop, especially in the outfield in particular, maybe a third baseman as well. They do have Freddie Freeman, who's still one of the best left-handed hitters in the game. He had a great year last year, and I don't think he's even 30 years old yet, but they certainly do need to try to go ahead and acquire more prospects moving forward. Also in the NL East, you have the New York Mets who re-signed Yoenis Cespedes. That was their big move. They're going to be going into this season trying to overtake the Washington Nationals, who signed Matt Wieters last week to catch for them. I should also state that they traded for Derek Norris from the Padres. So when you have now they have two catchers who are used to playing basically every day behind the plate, that should be an interesting dynamic because over his career, Wieters has been quite injury prone. He's been very, very injury prone. So I guess that's kind of a depth move. And Wieters didn't have any suitors in the offseason, which was an interesting situation for him, having been a 2 or 3 time All-Star, I believe. But he ended up signing with Washington. He ends up moving up the Beltway moving down the Beltway to D.C. From Baltimore. So that'll be an interesting move. The Nats, they did a number of things, and I still think they didn't really address their main issue. They They didn't. They let Mark Melancon go to the San Francisco Giants, and they didn't replace him. Instead, they were talking about trading for Chris Sale to bolster a really strong pitching staff that they already have in place. And then they went out and dealt their two best pitching prospects to the Sox for Adam Eaton when I don't really think they needed outfield help. So I'm really kind of scratching my head as to what Mike Rizzo's direction is as the GM in D.C., because you're going to move Eaton from where he was one of the best defensive guys in the game in right back to center, where he was really awful in 2015. And, because Bryce Harper's obviously the right fielder for the Nationals. Nobody's going to supplant Bryce Harper in right. But I don't know if trading for Adam Eaton really solves a whole lot of problems for the Nats. I thought that they already had a good leadoff man in Trey Turner. And, I thought that they already were pretty well stocked, defensive outfielders. So I don't know. It's an interesting situation for the Nats. They continue to get really close in the playoffs, and they get their hearts broken in a Game 5 once again with the Dodgers this past year. So they're trying to do what they can to fix the problems that they believe they have. But I always think that a team like that's on the doorstep, if anything, could use more bullpen help. They seemed like they had a pretty good lineup last year, and they had a great pitching staff, at least starting rotation, headed by Steven Strasburg and Max Scherzer. But it just seems like I don't really understand their direction at this point. So the Nats and the Mets, once again, will be expected to compete for the NL East title, with Noah Syndergaard taking the ball on opening day. I'll withhold making any predictions right now, but Syndergaard to me looks like a Cy Young candidate right away out of the gate. And then we move into the NL West with the Giants and the Dodgers in particular, and the Rockies. The Rockies made a bunch of moves, getting Ian Desmond to be their first baseman now, I guess. So that's really weird. But they look like they're trying to stock up to maybe make, if they get off to a hot start and they really hit the crap out of the ball in the first couple months, they do have the prospects to trade for a guy like Jose Quintana. We'll see if that's of interest to them. The Giants, like I said, they made the move for Mark Melancon. I still think that they might be interested in getting some third base help, so a guy like Todd Frazier might be interested in them at the deadline as well. The Dodgers, they traded for Logan Forsythe, I should say, and apparently that broke Evan Longoria's heart. As was shown on social media, he was very much like, we'll never be able to replace Logan Forsythe, and like that was my guy and all that. So I guess Longo's pretty pissed about losing his buddy, but Forsythe should really plug up their hole at second base. Chase Utley's getting pretty old. I know he re-signed, but he's getting pretty old. So having Forsythe there, and then they re-signed Justin Turner and Kenley Jansen. So the Dodgers, if they can get the production from Puig and Jock Peterson, they should be a pretty good team this year. They re-signed Rich Hill too. So they basically spent the majority of their money in the offseason to keep that team together. They got to Game 6 of the NLCS, and they're hoping that this year, with the same club coming back and maybe Kershaw being healthy for the whole season, that might push them over the edge to give them home field in the NLCS were they to play the Cubs again in October. So right now I think that it's the National League is pretty stagnant in that you basically have the same teams as last year that are going to be competing for postseason play. A lot of the teams that are rebuilding are still doing just that. They're rebuilding. They were in the first or second year of a rebuild. Now they're in the second or third year of a rebuild. Teams like Cincinnati, Milwaukee, like I mentioned, Atlanta, Philadelphia, those teams are still rebuilding. So we'll see what happens with them. But I don't really think that the National League, you're going to see a whole lot of movement in the standings this year. On the American League side of the coin, the Red Sox, in my opinion, were the big winners in trading for Chris Sale. I know that like signing Mitch Moreland doesn't seem like a big deal, but hey, that's another bat that you have in the equation. They get Pablo Sandoval back from his injury, and hopefully, I know he's allegedly lost a ton of weight, and hopefully he's in better shape going into this season, and he's more mentally ready to take the verbal pressure that you receive in Boston from the fans and the media. So I wish nothing but success for the Big Panda as he comes into the 2017 season. With the AL East in general, the Jays are another team that, you know, the clock is ticking on them. They re-signed Joey Bats, but they lost Edwin Encarnacion, so I think that probably hurts their standing in the AL East. And I think the team that replaces them probably will be the New York Yankees, having gone out and signed Aroldis Chapman, and they already have Dellin Betances in the bullpen, and they have a boatload of young prospects coming in. They also signed Chris Carter, which I think is a sneaky good deal, especially as a right-handed hitter with a short porch and left at Yankee Stadium. He could be a 40 home run guy if he gets off to a hot start. But like I was telling my boy Chris Jones, who's a diehard Yankee fan from South Bronx, he went to the U with me, and I worked with him for an extended period of time. That's my guy. Shout out Jonesy. As we were saying on social media last month when Carter got signed by the Yanks, the big key for him is to get off to the hot start. And Yankee fans love power hitters. They love the long ball, obviously. So if he comes out and hits 10 bombs in April, right, then that'll make him a fan favorite right away. That should relax him and allow him to fit in with this ball club, a young team that is definitely on the rise. So the Yankees didn't really have to make a lot of moves. They just have to wait on their prospects to come up, I think, and they'll be okay. But I am curious to see how that pitching staff turns out in New York. Masahiro Tanaka had a really good season last year. He's going to be their opening day starter. So, the Yanks are always an intriguing storyline, and they've, as they continue to bring their veterans back, guys like Nick Swisher and Alex Rodriguez coming back to be coaches during the spring training, and Derek Jeter still having an impact on the ball club in a number of behind-the-scenes ways. This is a team that's the guys from the 2000s are trying to pass down their world champion experience to the kids in the minor league system, which is great, I think. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the Yanks have to offer coming up in 2017. When we look at the American League, obviously the team that's going to come in, I think the two teams that are going to come in as the favorites are the Red Sox and the Indians. The Red Sox because they have a bevy of a great mix of young and veteran talent, and then the Indians because they got within an inning of winning the whole thing last year and they have everybody back. They also signed, as I mentioned, Edwin Encarnacion left the Jays, and he signed in Cleveland. So now the Indians, they lose Napoli, who went back to Texas, but you replace Mike Napoli with Edwin Encarnacion. That's a hell of a replacement. So I think with the pitching staff in place, the key for the Tribe is going to be to stay healthy on the mound especially. They've had a lot of injuries in the last few years. They need Carrasco and Salazar in particular to stay healthy and Kluber to be as strong as he was last year in order for this thing to work. So they should easily walk away with the AL Central, but they're going to have to if they get to the postseason, and I think they will, Encarnacion will be a big boost for them offensively. And we'll be right back to wrap up this offseason. And welcome back to the 2017 premiere episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks, and we're just wrapping up the American League offseason here. Talked about what some of the teams have done in particular, highlighting the Yankees, Red Sox, Blue Jays, and Indians. I'd like to shift the focus out west to the AL West. The Houston Astros were the team, I thought, in the West that made the biggest moves in terms of going out and getting Josh Reddick and Brian McCann, shore up their behind the plate situation and get another outfielder in there. Now you're talking about an outfield that, with guys like George Springer and Colby Rasmus and now Reddick, and then in the infield you got McCann behind the plate now with the stars that they have around the diamond. This is going to be a pretty good ball club coming into 2017. Alex Bregman at third was a first-round pick out of LSU in, I believe, 2015. And then you got a short Carlos Correa, who's a superstar in the making, one of the best young players in the game. Jose Altuve, one of the best players already in the game at second base in his prime. This is a really strong offensive position player ball club. The one concern that I have that I thought that would have made sense for them to address in the offseason, but they didn't really do it, was the starting pitching staff. And they have one of the better farm systems in the game. And they could have easily parted ways with a couple of guys to get Jose Quintana in particular. And they were also talking about trying to get Chris Archer from the Rays, but they just, for whatever reason, their front office just refused to make a move. And sometimes you can, value the prospects that you have a little too much, and I think in this situation that's exactly what happened with the Astros. So while I think they made enough moves from a position player standpoint to establish themselves as the favorites in the AL West, especially with the Rangers getting older. If they had traded for Quintana, they would have put themselves more in the mix to not just win the West, but win the AL pennant. So I just don't really think that they had a complete offseason. And I think if I was an Astros fan, I'd be a little bit disappointed with the passiveness of the front office in terms of trying to pull the trigger on a trade for a prospect, or not a prospect, for an elite starting pitcher, I should say. So that I thought that they had, like I said, kind of an incomplete offseason. And then the other major contender in the West, the Rangers, they're coming back with a number of the same old crew, kind of just the same group that they've had for almost the last decade now. Adrian Beltre's still there. They brought Mike Napoli back for a third time. They just love Napoli down in Dallas-Fort Worth, man, down in the Metroplex. That's their guy, I guess. But, I mean, he's obviously, he put up big numbers in the playoffs. He's a 30 home run guy, a good clubhouse guy. So, no fault in that. But it's an interesting thing to bring a guy back for a third time. See if they can squeeze out any more production from him. So, I mean, with the Rangers, if Yu Darvish is healthy, Cole Hamels has, been one of the most productive pitchers over the last decade in either league. With the top of the rotation being what it is, and some of the young guys that they're starting to bring up, like Nomar Mazara, and Rougned Odor, some of those guys who were really good for them last year as they won the division again and they got swept in the division series, but they still got to the playoffs. With those guys in the fold, they'll definitely be in the mix to try to win this division again for a third time in a row. But I do think the Astros are coming. I think that they are probably going to be the favorites heading into the 2017 season. So definitely I'll have to make that pick when the time comes, but those are the two teams in the West, I think, that are probably the teams of note to highlight as we come into this 2017 season. So with that being said, that wraps up my coverage of the 2016-17 MLB offseason. I'd like to shift gears a little bit here and talk about the voting for the Hall of Fame ballot for 2017. This year, the guys that got in, we had 3 players, a front office exec, and a former commissioner get in. So with the, I believe they call it like the modern era ballot. I think that's the name of it. Essentially, a lot of guys from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, players, execs, managers, ambassadors, so on and so forth. So it's essentially a lot of guys who are the guys who vote on this ballot are former players who are in the Hall of Fame from that era, and managers and media members who have written about that era as well. So, for instance, as a White Sox fan, I was hoping that Harold Baines would get in because he's on this ballot for the modern era, because Frank Thomas is a voter, one of his former White Sox teammates. So that just kind of gives you, if that paints the picture a little bit of the type of player that would be voting on this ballot and the type of player that would be on the ballot as a candidate. So the people that got in, the individuals that got in this year from the modern era ballot were former Commissioner Bud Selig and former Atlanta Braves general manager John Schuerholz. Schuerholz was the architect of those great Braves teams in the 90s that won the World Series in 95, and they won 15 straight NL East titles. So, they had that magnificent run, even though they only won one World Series, and, produced 3 Hall of Fame pitchers, probably a Hall of Fame third baseman in Chipper Jones, who will get in next year most likely, and then a Hall of Fame manager in Bobby Cox. So, Schuerholz, more than deserving. He was one of the best execs of the last 50 years in baseball, and that goes without argument. Selig, on the other hand, I don't really get this one because I, kind of make the parallel between MLB and the NFL. The NFL obviously isn't perfect by any means, especially with their Hall of Fame voting, but they selected, as a group, they decided not to vote in the former commissioner from the 90s and early 2000s, Paul Tagliabue, this year because of some controversial statements that he made about concussions in his career. Obviously that's like a major subject in football that doesn't really apply completely to baseball, but the way I look at it is concussions in football, controversial topic. Steroids in baseball in the 90s, controversial topic. Tagliabue on the wrong side of concussions, the voters, they held him accountable. He's not getting into Canton, at least this year. Selig, on the other hand, they threw that out the window completely, that he just basically looked the other way when the steroid issue was prevalent in the game, and they voted him in, no problem. So he survived a strike-canceled World Series, a tie in the All-Star game, and this steroid generation of baseball, and he still got in the Hall of Fame. And now it's looking extremely hypocritical on the behalf of the writers to vote Selig in, but then to keep Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens out. Once upon a time, I was super opposed to allowing guys who were known steroid users, or at least alleged steroid users, to get into the Hall of Fame. But I think you have to throw that out the window now that, Selig gets in. So I had changed my ballot the way I projected it. I had included Bonds and Clemens and a few other guys that had been linked to performance-enhancing drug use on my Hall of Fame ballot. But the only guys that ended up getting in on the regular ballot as players were Jeff Bagwell, Pudge Rodriguez, and former White Sox leadoff man Tim Raines. So those are the 3 that got in. To give you a quick snapshot of their careers, Raines played for 20-odd years. He's going to go in as an Expo. He had his greatest years in Montreal, so he's going to go in with the Expos hat on. Also had some really good seasons on the South Side in the early 90s, and finally won a World Series ring with the Yankees in 96. Almost got to 3,000 hits, was one of the top stolen base guys in the game other than Ricky Henderson. Great on-base percentage, really good defensive outfielder. It was a long time coming for Rock. He definitely deserved to get in. So that was he was probably, I think he was the most veteran guy on the ballot that got in of the inductees. The other two guys are a little bit more recent. Jeff Bagwell, the great Houston Astros slugger, he got in after being on the ballot for a couple years now. He helped them get to the World Series in 2005 when they played the Sox. Put up huge numbers in the 90s. Came over in a trade from the Boston Red Sox in the early 90s to the Astros, and quickly established himself as a 40 home run guy who could steal some bases at first base, which was an interesting skill set, not exactly the normal skill set of a first baseman. Really good defensive player at first, and just face of the franchise along with Craig Biggio for a long time in Houston. So Bagwell got in, so now you got two of the killer bees there in the Hall of Fame. And then the third guy, first ballot Hall of Famer, probably the greatest catcher in baseball since Johnny Bench, and that's Ivan Pudge Rodriguez, who's going to go in as a Ranger, I'd imagine. Had all those great years in Texas in the 90s. Was a world champion with the Marlins in 2003, and then part of the revitalization of the Detroit Tigers franchise in the mid-2000s when they got to the World Series in 2006. So all three of those guys are very deserving. They were great players in their own right. And then, of course, Sherholtz was one of the great execs of the last 50 years, like I said. The only guy I have an issue with getting in is Selig. I don't think he deserves to get in. But like I said, if he's going to get in, then you better start letting a lot of those other guys get in, like Bonds and Clemens. And, I think Sammy Sosa is up for consideration again, in my opinion. I'm not a big Sosa guy, but his numbers were off the charts. Kurt Schilling, a guy who I think is a complete jag-off, but, he won those World Series in Arizona and Boston and won some Cy Youngs and was perennial All-Star, so he's got to be in the mix now. I think Rafael Palmeiro, you just kind of open it up for everybody to get in again, because if you're going to let the commissioner in who allowed this stuff to happen and look the other way while it was happening, then you got to start letting the players in too. So that's my stance on it. I know that not everybody would agree with that, but that's how I view it. So that's kind of where the Hall of Fame stands. I think next year should be a good class with Jim Thome and Chipper Jones getting the opportunity to get in. And then you're going to get some of the guys who were close this year, like Mike Mussina and Trevor Hoffman. Bonds and Clemens are getting closer now. So I think it'll be a strong class in 2018 as well, and we won't have to listen to Bud Selig give a speech next year, which will be nice, because I think that turns my stomach to think that he's going to get in. I think that he was a mediocre commissioner at best and totally undeserving of the honor that it is to get into Cooperstown. So, but that being said, I'm looking forward to the 2018 class. So we will come back with our final segment with me wrapping it up as to what I've done in the off season to kind of get myself ready for the upcoming regular season, and just kind of what I do in general, and some recommendations that I have for my fellow fans out there. And so we will be right back with the final segment of the 2017 premiere episode of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. And welcome back to the premiere episode of the 2017 season for the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. In this episode, we've talked about the offseason for both the White Sox and the Cubs, as well as around the big leagues. And we've also discussed the Hall of Fame voting, which featured 4 out of the 5 guys that I thought deserved to get in. The only guy I had an issue with was Bud Selig. But I'm looking forward to the 18 class because I know a lot of great players whose careers I really enjoyed have the opportunity to get in as well. So with this final segment, I just kind of want to wrap things up by talking about what I've done as a fan in the offseason to get myself ready for the 2017 season. This has been an interesting offseason for me. I've actually gotten the opportunity to read a couple of books this offseason, more historical baseball topics. One book that I really would recommend for baseball fans out there, especially I got a couple buddies who are Dodger fans. You guys know who you are. This book is called The Last Innocents, and it's about the Dodgers in the 60s and kind of how they fit into the political, social, historical context of the era. Because obviously the 60s, that's a really prominent subject in U.S. history, for a number of reasons. And it just kind of discusses how those great Dodger teams with Koufax and Drysdale and Maury Wills, how they fit into the dynamic of that decade. So it's a really interesting book. I'm about halfway through it. I also when it comes to reading topics, I'm a big biography guy too. So I have Bob Gibson's biography that I've been kind of perusing through, a Roberto Clemente biography that I've been working my way through, and then my father got an opportunity to purchase Dick Allen's biography as well. God Almighty Himself, that's what it's called. So I haven't gotten the opportunity to start reading that one. Been kind of busy with work and other personal things going. So, it's definitely something that I'm trying to get more into, get back into, I should say, as the season approaches, getting a chance to read some of these books on some of the great players and great teams that I certainly revere throughout the years. So like I said in my first ever episode last March, I think the era from the time that Jackie Robinson broke into the big leagues until about the early 70s, right when free agency was getting ready to hit, I think that 25 to 30 years time span between essentially 1947 and about 1975, I think that's really the golden age of baseball history. I think that's the most interesting time period because so many different things happened, not just integration, but you have you go from a time period when there were no teams west of St. Louis. There were only 16 total teams in baseball. There was no playoffs. It was just 154 games, and then the World Series the first week of October. The World Series games were played in the afternoon. To West Coast expansion, which is what some of this book with the Dodgers talks about when they moved from Brooklyn to L.A. in the late 50s. So you get some of that in the book. You have that time period where you start seeing West Coast expansion. Then you're adding more franchises. Then in the 60s, you got 10 teams in each league, so 20 total teams. You still don't have a playoffs. And then you expand even more in the late 60s. Then you get divisional play. You get your league championship series, the World Series. You start playing World Series games at night, which totally changes. You move away from the nostalgia of an afternoon World Series game, and so you kind of lose kids that way, younger fans. But there was a lot of changing aspects of the game, I guess, going on at that time, especially with. And then at the very end, you have the DH coming into the American League in '73. So a lot of changes that we take for granted as just being everyday things in baseball started taking place during that time period. So like I said, and then of course you talk about the great players and the great teams. You can go on for days with the number of faces of the game, your Mazes and your Mantles of the world playing at that time. So definitely a number of interesting reading topics to go through, and I only touched on the tip of the iceberg, if you will, in terms of some of the books that I've been perusing through. So when you have that's one of the things I've been doing this off season is reading a little bit. I've also got kind of a tradition that I know a number of baseball fans kind of replicate in their own right. You got to watch some baseball movies, some baseball documentaries. I'm a huge documentary guy, so for me, I'll randomly look up the YouTube clips of like the old ESPN Classic Sports Century. That I felt like that was one of the best documentary series that you'll ever have when it comes to sports, because they would do an hour biography on the greatest athletes of all time, regardless of sport. But in terms of a baseball context, I've watched the one on like Frank Robinson, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Clemente, Jackie Robinson, Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, all those guys. And then I think the gold standard for baseball documentaries, in my opinion, is the Ken Burns 10-part series that came out in the 90s. That's, for me, number one on the list. I usually like to watch that like part by part as we head into late March, right before the season starts. Try to kind of work that around the NCAA tournament. So that's one of the things that I really like to do, because that's just a great documentary series, and I definitely recommend it. Each episode's about 2 hours long, so it's like 18-20 hours worth of footage, but you have to kind of space it out over time. But it's just an excellent documentary series. Like I said, they go over each decade of baseball. The first inning is basically all the 19th century, and then you get into the decades leading up to 2010, basically, because in 2009, I believe it was 2009 or 10, he released the 10th inning to kind of bring you up to speed from the early 90s to 2009. So that was the 10th part in the series. But that's, for me, the gold standard. That's the one that if you're a baseball fan, it's a must-watch. So there's that one, and just like, your typical baseball movies. For me, Field of Dreams is my favorite one. I think that's the best done baseball movie that there is. Major League is right behind it. Bull Durham is another great one that I enjoy. Pride of the Yankees is a classic. It's an older film, but it's a great movie in its own right. I know that's my mom's favorite baseball movie for sure. There's a ton of them out there. It's that I think baseball and probably basketball, those are probably the two sports that have the best movies, if that makes sense. So I think for me, those are probably the three pinnacle ones, though: Field of Dreams, Major League, and Bull Durham. So I'll definitely get a chance to watch at least a couple of those movies, and maybe try to squeeze in Sandlot as well. That's another classic. Any guy that grew up playing baseball in the 90s as a kid has probably watched that movie about 1 million times and then recited every line from that movie as well. So Sandlot is definitely in the mix for that too. So I have all 4 of those movies on DVD, and I'll try to mix in those movies at some point. But I would say the other thing that what this off season is particularly interesting, because we have the World Baseball Classic, which gets us right into the swing of things even earlier than normal. For me, I like the WBC. it's a good format. The only issue that I have, and there's just nothing you can really do about this because there's just no way MLB teams would ever sign off on this, but I think it would be better, ideally for the quality of play, if you played the WBC like in the middle of the season, and instead of having an all-star break, you like shorten the regular season in years that you're going to do the WBC, and then you just have it during the month of July. Because at that point in the season, the guys will be well rested. Well, not well rested, but they'll be in the flow of play, and you're not going to be speeding up the clock, if you will, on getting starting pitchers, getting their arms extended, ready to pitch. Right now, in order to make the WBC happen, they start the spring training games earlier in years that they do it. So this year, the spring training games started about a week and a half earlier than they normally would. And, I mean, it works because you get guys ready to pitch, but the pitch count is so short, so small at the beginning of the tournament. I'd rather see a starting pitcher be able to pitch a regular game in the middle of July than have him only be able to throw 3 innings because his arm isn't extended. So for me, like I said, I like the WBC, but because starting pitchers aren't extended and because it's in March, which isn't like really primetime baseball season, I'm not as enamored with the tournament as I probably would be if it was in the middle of the season and they did the format that way. But like I said, the liability issues in terms of injuries in the middle of the season are greater if you do it in July than they are in March, because let's say you're a first-place ball club and you do this tournament in July and you lose your ace or your best hitter, and the front office and the ownership of that team that lost that player is going to be super pissed, and rightfully so. But I think as much as I want to add the WBC to my off-season baseball diet, it's only going to be done in doses because, like I said, I like the format, but I just don't like the time of year it's played, and it's going to interfere with the NCAA tournament because I don't really like to ramp myself up as a fan until a week or so before the season starts. So I will watch, though. I think Team USA this year has probably the best lineup that they've ever had since the tournament began. But the question always is, with any team in this tournament, is who has the pitching. The team with the pitching wins this tournament because, your arm isn't extended at this point in the year. So the guys who can actually, muscle their way through 3 or 4 innings as a starter, those are the teams that are going to have the best chance of winning the World Baseball Classic. But those are some of the things I like to do. I'm a big books and movies guy, and I'll try to incorporate the WBC as much as I can this year, but with my Gophers in the NCAA tournament, we'll see if that really happens. And with that, we'll be right back to just wrap up this first episode of 2017 on the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. And we're back with this premiere episode for the 2017 season of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. This is your host, Ben Jacks. And I'd just like to wrap up today's episode by kind of discussing what I'd like to do this year on the pod. First off, my goal is to get more guests, okay? I'm trying to get more people on the show and going to branch out. So if you're interested in coming on live and giving your opinion live on the air, Kevin McGrath, my executive producer, we have the Facebook page that we run that I know that some of you guys follow already. So from there, if you're interested in getting on the show, and I'll post this as a post on the page once we post this episode. If you're interested in coming on the show, just please indicate so on the Facebook page, and then we'll accommodate the best we can to get you on. I know for some of the Minnesota guys it might be tough, but I plan on definitely coming up there at some point during the season, so we can get some of you guys on, because I know some of my guys in Minnesota it's not all Twins fans up there. I know a number of Brewer fans up there. Like I said, Jonesy, I know you're a Yankees fan. I know you've been trying to get on the show for a minute, so we're going to try to get you on this year as well. And then down here in the Chicago area, I know I have a number of friends that are Cubs fans, Cardinal fans, just all over the place. So, Brian Went, dude, I'm interested in getting you on the show this year. We need to get you on, and I know you heard that, so we're going to get you on the show this year, man. No problem. You'll be the first Cub representative on the show that we've had. So I'm trying to. We're going to try to diversify it a bit this year, not just have me rambling on for an hour. I know that gets pretty stagnant, not just for the listeners, but for yours truly. So also, I'm going to get both my parents back on. I know that both of their episodes were a real hit last year. I had a lot of people coming up giving me positive feedback on that. They really liked my mom's perspective as a female fan, and then my dad's perspective, just having the historical knowledge that he has, having the mind like a steel trap, just having all these memories come back, and being able to tie what he saw 50 years ago as a little kid into what he saw last year with the Cubs, for instance. So we'll definitely get both of my folks on the podcast next, this upcoming season, and I really want to just try to make sure that this year's podcast gets more people involved and gets more fan bases involved, so that way we're not ending up talking about the Sox when they've lost 90 games in September. I don't want to have to do that, so we're going to do what we can to, like I said, diversify the show. Also, we're going to try to come up with more frequent episodes, maybe shorter, but more frequent episodes every 2 weeks or so during the season. I think a half hour every 2 weeks is a pretty good format, and I think that would be an interesting way of doing it. And just also, I'm going to try to tie in things that aren't just giving you updates on the season, because, like I said, anybody can watch baseball, but I think not just more in-depth analysis, if you will, but just more different angles of baseball fandom. I think, not to toot my own horn here, but I think the segment that we just had, where I discussed some of the books and documentaries and movies that I watch to get me ready for the season, I think those are some more interesting topics. I think we're going to try to touch on more of those things. We might try to touch more on baseball analytics this year. I'm a big fan of the advanced numbers and how sabermetrics ties into the game now. It's a very integral part of how teams run their front offices. So that's something I definitely want to explore more this year. Another segment that I'd like to discuss here on the episode is I am really interested in getting my old buddy Charlie Stone involved in this. We've discussed this, where we're going to talk about how the numbers apply to MLB legalized gambling, that sphere of baseball fandom. So we're going to talk about, I guess, more of like the gambling aspect of it, like prop bets and preseason bets and things like that. I'm gonna try to get Charlie on here, or at least try to get his input on the show before the season starts, because it's interesting how Vegas works with prop betting, and I think that's something that I know that Carmen and Yurko on ESPN Radio, they'll talk about that. I don't want to devote an entire show to it, but I think it's an interesting aspect of sports fandom and sports business in general. And that might be another issue that I'd like to talk about as well, is the business of the game, the marketing of the game, how that works. And then one other thing, kind of just tying into bringing more guests on the show, more of my friends and family that know the game well. I'd also like to open up a suggestion box, maybe not a suggestion box, but a Q&A situation on our Facebook page to get people to ask questions about what's going on in the game prior to the podcast, the upcoming podcast, so I can answer your questions at the end of the show before, during every upcoming show. So I know a number of podcasts do that, so I figured that would be a nice segment to throw in there as well to get you guys tied in. For those of you who may not want to get on the show and get up here and talk, that's a perfect way of doing it. So those are some of the things that I'd like to bring to the show this year in 2017 as we continue to expand and try to make this as much of a listener-friendly show as possible. I think Kevin would definitely agree with that. That's something that he'd like to see. That would probably be a direction that he'd like to see the show go, to make it as listener-friendly as we can. So we're going to try to add some of those things as the season progresses, but in the near future, what you guys can expect is another episode, the second episode of the season, which will be the 2017 regular season preview. That'll come out Final Four weekend, so look for that release around Saturday, April 1st, I would say. We'll try to record that during the week, the last week of March, and get that released on Final Four Saturday, like I said. So for my executive producer, Kevin McGrath, this is your host, Ben Jacks, and I am signing off for this initial episode of the 2017 season of the Ben Jacks Baseball Podcast. We look forward to bringing you more baseball knowledge and entertainment coming up over the next 7 months or so. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you guys later in this month.
Woke up wrong this morning. Was a fly on the wall. I set my thoughts in motion.